All right.
So just a quick introduction. Alan is going to do a little bit of the overview of solar PV, the technology, and all of that sort of stuff. And I'm going to cover the sizing and understanding how big or small a solar system is appropriate for you. And I'll let Alan introduce himself.
Okay, hi, I'm Alan Jackson. I've been working for the agency now for 3 years. I'm one of the senior engineers, and I am also actually an organic farmer as well. Okay, so I suppose we'll kick off. So, and I suppose, second. Okay, so I suppose the reason why PV is getting so popular and to talk about renewable energy is this: it's global warming and climate change. And we can see from, I suppose, the top half of this slide that this has been the hottest decade on record. And as you can see, last year has been the second hottest year on record. And the last 5 years have also been the hottest on record. So we can see that, you know, global warming is happening. Ice is melting faster than it's ever before. I think it's about melting 6 times faster now than it was 40 years ago. Sea levels are rising, etc. We have places that, you know, there's no frost anymore, frost-free seasons. There's more flooding, there's more droughts, and it's a big risk of disease as well, and disease spreading. So I suppose it's time that for us all to try and step up and try and do our part in trying to reduce our own emissions. Just the graph then below, you know, shows the last 400,000 years. So how they do that and how they can calculate that is they take ice cores and at the amount in the ice, so they can find out what carbon dioxide was in the atmosphere 400,000 years ago. And as you can see that the average, it fluctuates all the time, and the average is maybe around, you know, 220. And then we get to 1950, and the amount is just increasing rapidly. And we're at around 400 parts per million now. And, you know, so we're nearly at twice what the average was in the last 400,000 years. So I suppose, look, we all have to do our best and try and reduce our own emissions. So what I'm going to look at is, first of all, just a quick overview, I suppose, on the basis of just electricity units and what they are, the basics of solar production, and kind of the typical outputs of a PV panel and a PV array and the paybacks associated with it. And then I suppose if you're looking to get an installer, how do you pick an installer and what grants are currently available. Okay, so first of all, very basic here is just 1 kilowatt is 1,000 watts, okay? And a watt is the rate of power consumption. So if you compare that to driving a car, it should be the actual speed you're driving at. Where a kilowatt hour is a quantity of power. Again, if you compare that to a car, it would be the kilometers that you actually drive. So we're going to have a quick little guess here. I'm going to give you 10 seconds here to fill in the chat box of guess the wattage to appliances. So first of all, we have a kettle. So I'm going to give you 10 seconds just for people to type in what they think wattage a kettle is. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, I can't see any answers here, but I'm just going to go ahead anyway. So this kettle anyway is 3 kilowatts. And obviously you can get higher kettles and lower kettles wattages, but this kettle is a 3 kilowatts kettle. So if this is used for 2 hours a week, because the kettle is 3 kilowatts, and we're using it for 2 hours, we're going to use 6 kilowatt hours or 6 units of electricity. So it's a unit of electricity is what you're charged for on your bill when you look at your bill. And just for simplicity, I'm going to say it's 20 cents. So that'll cost you €1.20 for using your kettle for 2 hours. An electric shower then. So I'll give you another few seconds there just to see how what people think an electric shower, how many kilowatts an electric shower would be. So an electric shower, this is I think it's a Kitchen T90, and it's a 9 kilowatt shower. So the cost for running this for 2 hours, again, is 9 kilowatts multiplied by 2 for the 2 hours, and at 20 cents is €3.60. So you can see it costs 3 times as much to run as the kettle, because the kettle is 3 kilowatts. So moving on then, I suppose, just to the basics of solar PV. So you can see the graph on the top right of your screen there. So since 2009, the price of the PV modules themselves have fallen by around 80%. So PV systems are becoming more feasible. So back a number of years ago, when they were more expensive, it was still feasible to install them in places like Spain. You can see the graph at the bottom, where Spain maybe gets 1.5 times the irradiance that we get here. But now that the price has fallen, it makes them feasible as well. And obviously, with grant aid as well, makes it payback. PV as well, I suppose, as you can see written there, it's a proven and mature technology. You install it, it'll last 25 years plus. So you push it up, there's no maintenance, there's very, very low maintenance with it, practically none. You may have to maybe change the inverter once over that 25 years. So that's why PV is really catching on, unlike a wind turbine where you have, you know, high maintenance costs every year. Okay, so what we're talking today is photovoltaic panels, and these panels generate electricity as opposed to the solar thermal panels that produce hot water. So this electricity can then be used, once it's generated from the panels, can be used in the house with any electrical appliance like you normally would use, and it can also heat your hot water. And Paul will talk a little bit more about diverting the excess into your hot water. The only difference is, I suppose, is the solar panels produce DC power, and which is direct current, and this current has to be changed in AC alternating current at 240 volts, which is the same electricity that you get in from the grid. So it has to match that electricity from the grid, so it'll be able to power your appliances, and as well, if you have access, to be put it back onto the grid at the same voltage and the same type of electricity. Just going to, I suppose originally solar panels were made to charge batteries. So if you look at the picture there, you see the bottom left, you have a solar cell. So each solar cell is roughly half a volt. So originally panels had 36 cells in it to charge a 12 volt battery. So that'll give you 18 volts. It has to be higher than 12 volt to charge it. And that's where, you know, your 36 panel came from. But now, as they're grid tied, it doesn't really matter how many cells. So the cells are maybe still 72 cells, and they're changing all the time. But again, you can just see from that picture again the look of the actual solar panels. So that bottom left, where you see them on the roof, is kind of your typical solar array fixed to your roof. The ones on the right-hand side, so the top right, they look exactly like slates. But they are PV panels, but I know they'll be a lot more expensive to put up. But you know, in certain sensitive areas, if you need to put them up, it'll be, you know, they do look good. Okay, so how the solar PV system works. So there's a number of different components to it. So first of all, the sunlight is shining on the panels, and those little silicon cells that you saw in the previous slide, and the electrons start to move in those. And once those electrons move in those panels, it creates a current and produces your electricity, your DC electricity. So you can see there, as it moves from 1 to 2, it goes to an inverter. And the inverter there is changing it from your DC power into your AC power. And from there, it goes into number 3, which is into your home, into your distribution board. and from your distribution board, it'll go into all your plugs in your house. But if you have, say, a low demand, and you're not there in the middle of the day, and you have a low demand, and the PV is at full output and it's at 2 kilowatts, and the house only needs 1 kilowatt, the other spare 1 kilowatt will flow out through the meter and onto the electricity lines. And same goes for if your solar panels are just producing 1 kilowatt, or it's at night time, your electricity can come in from the grid, so you're never without power. Okay, so just in terms then of the orientation and shading. So in Ireland, the optimum inclination, which is the slope on your roof, is 35 degrees for your PV panels, and obviously south facing will give you the maximum amount of power from your PV. But you can also actually, you know, if you don't have a south facing roof, you can also put it on an east west. And if you look at the east west, you can see that go down along the west, and at 35 degrees, 79, 80%, you'll still be able to produce about 80% of your output. The difference with east-west, though, is that obviously when the sun rises in the east, it's going to hit the east panels first, and as the sun goes round, then it'll get the west panels. So you'll actually have more power being generated at the start of the day and at the end of the day than in the middle of the day with the south-facing ones. And that may suit people as well. If you're not there in the middle of the day and you're using more power at the start and end of the day, it may suit and balance out. Just in terms of shading then as well, just make sure that, you know, you may have a chimney in the way, you may have an aerial, you may have, you know, a tree, whatever. So you just have to be careful in terms of shading. Now, if you can't get rid of shading, you just have to be, you know, if shading occurs on one panel, it can affect the rest of the panels. But you can get little micro inverters that will invert the power on each panel to stop that from happening. So there are different ways around it, and there's PV optimizers as well. So looking at the typical output from the panel. Okay, so the capacity factor is 10%. So that means that if you have, say, a 10 kilowatt array, it will produce 10% of that on average 24/7. So you have a 10 kilowatt array, obviously it's dark at night time, it's not going to produce anything, but on average through the year, it'll produce around 1 kilowatt. So looking at different PV arrays in Ireland, and looking like they produce around 900 kilowatt hours. So 900 units of electricity per year for each kilowatt you put up. So the average house uses 4,200 kilowatt hours per year. So that's just a little calculation there to see, right, if you wanted to produce enough electricity to power your house on a net basis. And I mean a net basis means that obviously there'll be times you'll have to export and times you'll have to import. But if you had 14 panels, you should produce enough electricity for your house on this net basis. But it typically makes sense to put up around 2 kilowatts on your house. And Paul will which is 7 panels, and Paul will go through that a little bit more later. So the 7 panels as well, just important to note as well, under the planning regulations at the minute, and they may change in the near future, but at the minute you're allowed 12 meters squared. And each panel is 1 meter by 1.6 meters. So 7 panels is just under 12 meters squared. So in most circumstances, you can put up 7 panels without planning permission, but always check with your planners. So I suppose looking at the paybacks here, and I suppose a lot of this can be influenced by the price that you're paying for electricity and the price that you're going to pay for your panels and the grants that you can get. But just on this hypothetical situation here, you've 2 kilowatt array. costing you €5,000 including that. The cost of electricity, and this is coming from 23 cents per kilowatt including that. This is coming from the SEI website, and this is the average amount that people in Ireland are paying for their electricity at the moment. So if you have a 2 kilowatt array, as we said before, it produces 900 units of electricity, 900 kilowatt hours, producing 1,800 kilowatts. Now, as I was saying, you're not going to use all that in the house because there are times when you're not there and you don't need the load and it'll be exported to the grid. So say we split 15% to the grid. So looking at the savings then, so the amount of kilowatts that you actually will use from your PV that you would have otherwise imported is 1,800 multiplied by 0.85, 85%. You want to use 85% of it, getting you 1,530 kilowatt hours. That's 23 cents, that amounts to €352. Now, at the moment, you cannot get an income for the electricity that you export onto the grid. But this is, we've been told, about to change, and I've put in 4 cents. I don't know what it's going to be. So here in this situation, you're exporting 270 kilowatt hours, which amounts to around €10. So the total saving per year is around €360. So the payback without any grant is around 13, 14 years. If you get the SEI grant, you're down to about 8.8 years. But a lot of this, as I said, is based on the price that you're actually paying for electricity at the minute and the price of the array. And there's also maybe VAT implications for some people and other situations. Okay, now this is just kind of showing typical output of an array, and this is courtesy of Robert Goss in Solar Electric. And it's just to show you, he has a 3.6 kilowatt array here, and it produced in 2019 3,358 kilowatt hours. So this system did kind of above what we were saying, around the 900. So he's obviously down close to the south of Ireland, where there's more sunshine. So 392 kilowatt hours per year, which is very good. And again, these are just 3 small graphs, just showing that, you know, the month of May, this is 2019 as well, the sun doesn't always shine. You do have fluctuations every day. And also this, as you can see, in January, obviously, you know, it starts producing electricity there at 9 o'clock in the morning, and it doesn't produce a whole lot, and that'll be a sunny day. And then again, in the summertime, you can see it produces a lot more. So in the wintertime, you will not get a lot of electricity from your array. And just very quickly to finish off then, when you are getting an installer, make sure that they're tier 1 panels. Tier 1 panels mean that the company is financially stable and that they'll be around for a long time if anything does go wrong with the panels. Also, the installer has to be registered with SEAI, especially if you're getting a grant from SEAI. Always get at least 3 quotes as well. Talk to others who've put PV up and who they got to install it. Word of mouth is also is very good. And make sure then, if you're getting the SEI grant, that a BER is included in the costs, because that will need to be included. So, and in terms of the grant eligibility, the house, this is the current grant at the moment. The house has to be built and occupied before 2011. Must have a BER cert of a C or better once the installer is completed. And the grant that you're allowed is €900 per kilowatt that you install, up to 2 kilowatts. So if you install 2 kilowatts, you're getting your €1,800 off of that. After that, you have to put a battery in, and you can see there that the extra grant that you can get for a battery and an extra few kilowatts. And the total grant is capped at €2,400. So that's all I have for you. And if you have any questions there later, we'll answer them.
Very good. Alan, if you could just unshare your screen there, that would be great. So there's another poll just coming up there. So we just give a couple of minutes, a couple of seconds to answer that poll while I get my screen up and running. And on average, people thought solar PV was about average value. There was a lot of answers for three out of 5, with a few below and a few above, and a little bit maybe skewed above. But there you go. It's an interesting question. So I hope you can all see the screen there. Is that okay? Yeah.
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 Okay. So there's a tiny little bit of overlap between myself and Alan, but really what I'm going to try and do really is outline how, well, for want of a better word, how you should think about sizing your solar system. So you should decide what size solar system you should get for yourself, rather than an installer maybe telling you that you want a particular size. Fairly likely that might be a bigger size system than you want. And every homeowner is a little bit different. So, you know, you could have various different sizes. And we'll try and maybe empower you all to make your own choices. So there was one question about a flat roof system. So I think all the images on the other one were kind of sloped roofs. So this is just an image from the Tipperary County Council headquarters building. So this was installed in 2014 and produces about 13% of their average use per annum. And as you can see there, all the panels are mounted on rails and frames. They're all connected in a lattice, and the reason they're all connected in a lattice is to ensure that they don't lift. And you might be able to see located on these is ballast. So essentially these are curbs that are designed, they're standard curbs to allow an appropriate amount of ballast to ensure that they don't lift. So you might think you might think that the issue with solar PV on roofs is weight of the solar PV, but actually by far the biggest issue is lift when it's windy. So you don't want them to lift either your roof or lift themselves. So really what I'm going to cover is where to start. So a little bit around energy efficiency and being sensible about what you do. I'm going to maybe expand on Alan's comment around, and Alan, if you can see if you can answer some of the questions and answers that are coming through, that would be great. Talk about home energy use and how to use it. I'll cover a little bit around solar PV production. And then how to get them, if you don't use very much power and you're out most of the day, then you really shouldn't have a very large solar system. However, if you've got a lot more energy use, if you've got a battery, if you've got an electric car, that should say batteries, heat pumps, and EVs. So apologies for that. So that's what we're going to cover. So I think it's important to say, no matter how much I think solar is a great idea, you don't start with solar, but you need a minimum BER, as Alan said. You need to be a minimum of C. So there's no point really in putting a relatively expensive generation technology on a building that is losing a lot of energy because it's very inefficient. So you get more savings, you get more benefits. There are lower greenhouse gases through reducing the amount of energy you use. So you start by saving energy, and then you generate your energy. So in terms of thinking about where you would invest your money, if you had 4, 5, 6, 7,000 to install a technology, think about where you might start. So the average home uses around 18,000 kilowatt hours of heat and produces about 4.5 tons of CO2. That's the average Irish house. So a large rural house, for example, in Tipperary, that 18,000 kilowatt hours of heat might be 30,000 kilowatt hours of heat. Or a small mid-terrace house in the middle of a city might be 12,000 kilowatt hours. So the average, according to the CSO, is around 18,000. You use about 4,200 kilowatt hours of electricity. And each fossil fuel car uses about 12,000 kilowatt hours, which is essentially 17,100 kilometers at 6 liters per 100 kilometer, which is about 3 tons of CO2. So when you're thinking about energy, I always encourage everyone to think about all forms of energy and think about what you're going to do. And just there's a lot of discussion at the moment around SUVs. The International Energy Agency painted a fairly grim picture that all of the energy savings from improved engines, all of the regulations across the world, and even electric cars, they're all getting eaten up by people carrying around a bigger car in terms of an SUV and the trend towards larger cars. So they use about 30 to 40% more energy than a standard Toyota Corolla C-Class standard car, not so much a Mercedes C-Class. So it's important to think about all of the different facets of how you use energy. So you reduce it first, electrify heat and transport where possible, and then you can supply it with your renewable energy. And I'll give some examples of that as we go through. So this was a study we did in 2012 of 100 homes where we put a lot of monitoring equipment in. The orange is refrigeration, it's just a bit hidden. So you can see roughly what that looks like in terms of a lot of the energy use. So refrigeration happens all the time. Lighting happens in the winter. Your IT and laundry and cooker and kitchen sockets, you can see roughly the share. And that was a study of Irish homes, about 7 or 8 years ago. There's obviously no electric car in there, and there's no heat pump in there. So we look at that as it changes to think about where that's going. So that's about 4,200. If you take an example of a car with a heat pump and electric car, so this is my own house, you can see that it's become a small component of the overall energy use, and your electric car becomes a big part of your summer energy use in particular, and heating less so, because obviously it happens in the winter when we don't get a lot of sun. So thinking about what is a useful piece, a useful size of solar for me in my home, I've got a car that I can run off the roof. If you've got solar thermal panels, it's not much use. Your PV isn't much use to do your hot water. But if you don't, then it is. So we'll talk a little bit about this as we go along. So just what's really important to say is decide what you have in your house. What are you going to do in the next while? If you're going to buy an EV in the next year or two, it's certainly worth thinking about sizing your solar for that electric vehicle if that's what you intend to do. So Alan kind of threw up a slide at the end there in terms of solar production. So you can see that's a south-facing 1.8 kilowatt solar system. So it produces lots of power really from March, April, May, June, July, August, September. That's 2019. And it doesn't produce very much power in November, December, January, February. And what's really important to think about that is that power is November, December, January, February is when we use most of our heat. So we're quite northern latitude, so we get a lot of sun in the summer and we get very dark winters. The further north you go, the sharper this curve in the middle, and if you're at the equator, it's much flatter. So I have often seen people selling PV for heating, and I would think that that's a very silly idea. So size your solar panels for what you use in April, May, June, July, August, what you use in the summer when there isn't heat. Yes, you will produce some power that is usefully used in your heat pump. You will produce some power that's usefully used for domestic hot water in the summer, but it won't be, if you were to try and supply your heat pump with your solar panels in the roof, you might need a 40 kilowatt hour system or a 40 kilowatt system, which would produce huge amounts in the summer that you get no value for. So you size solar for April to September usage. A little comes in the winter, but not a lot. And solar for heating, not at 52 degrees north, which is our latitude. And I just took a statistical analysis of some solar production data. So, you want to look at somewhere sizing your solar system based on what you'll use somewhere between the average and maximum. So on average in May, which is the month we're in now, for each kilowatt you have installed facing south, you'll get about 4.5 kilowatt hours per day. So if you have a 4 kilowatt system, you'll get 4, 4, 16. So you get about 18 kilowatt hours on average. And if you have a 2 kilowatt system, you get 9. So that's very simple in unit terms that Alan talked about. You get about 9 units off a 2 kilowatt hour system. Can you use 9 units? Will you use 9 units? Will you use somewhere between 9 and 16 units off a 2 kilowatt hour system? And that's a little bit challenging to get your head around, but we'll make it a little bit easier as we go through. So as Alan said, it's not all sunny days. That's the same date that Alan put up in his graph of the 14th of May, which was our only completely clear day of the year so far. So you can see the generation of a solar array there over a day. So that's in graphical terms what no clouds mean. It doesn't look like that most of the time. We get about 4 days a year that we get a curve like that, and some of them are in the winter and the curve is quite small. So on the left, you'll see probably a very similar graph to Alan put up. The one on the left is 1.8 kilowatts south facing, and the one on the right is 3 kilowatts west facing. So again, even though you're facing west, it still produces quite a substantial amount of power. It's a bigger system, costs more to put in, but produces more power. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we get on. So you size your system based on using all of the average and most of the peak, but don't worry about, like, I wouldn't look at a solar system and say, we say on the left-hand side graph that 1.8 kilowatt system produces 13 kilowatt hours on a very, very sunny day. I must use all of that, because it only happens 4 days a year. So you wouldn't get yourself into a position or you wouldn't worry about trying to use every bit of a very, very sunny day. So what I would say is try and use most of it, but not all of it. And ideally have some dump loads. We'll talk about that in a minute. Things like an immersion dump. It's a small piece of equipment, maybe 400 euros or so, that will switch on your immersion a couple of watts at a time and use up whatever excess you have. And a battery is obviously very useful. It's more expensive, and we'll talk a little bit about that, but provides a use for all your power. So what can solar be used for? So very important. Domestic hot water in summer, and again, that depends very much on what you use in your home. We've monitored some homes, and we saw as little as 1 kilowatt hour per person. And we have seen homes that use 30 kilowatt hours of domestic water with daughters. So anyone with kids know that there's quite a considerable hot water usage, and as they go through adolescence, if they have long hair, they might spend a long time in the shower, and you'll use a lot of hot water. So think about, are you a small user? Are you a large user? The average is about 7 kilowatt hours a day. So, you could probably assume that I think it's, if you've occupancy of 3 or 4 people, you'd use about 7 kilowatt hours per day. If you've got a pump shower that uses a lot of hot water, that'll be higher. So when you talk about an electric car, so an electric vehicle, EV, it will use a little if it is away most of the time during the day, and you will be able to use a lot of power in your EV if it is at home during the day. So what's been really interesting for the last 2.5 months, about 95% of our electric car journeys have been powered from the roof. So if you have, for example, if you're at home during the day, you work from home, and you have a run to pick up the kids in the morning, or to drop the kids at school in the morning, and same in the evening, and your car is parked during the day and it's set to absorb whatever sun is produced. That's a brilliant way to, you know, and you'll be able to use an awful lot of power and therefore install a larger solar system. You'll only be able to use a little in a heat pump. So you can use it in the summer to drive your hot water. However, a hot water cycle on a heat pump usually runs at 4 or 5 kilowatts. So you will need a very large array or a battery and a normal sized array. So your washing machine, dishwasher, other appliances can be scheduled to run during the day, and most people with solar systems will run their washing machine and dishwasher between 11 and 2 or 11 and 3 in the afternoon and use the sun to power them. Quite easy to do. And again, how much you put in that, if you've got 2 people in the house, you run the dishwasher twice a week and you have 3 loads a week in your washing machine, that's one thing. If it's a house with 2 kids that love messing around in the garden and they're filthy every evening, then you have a lot more washing. The other thing I suppose to think about is your base load. So that's the constant load you have. So your IT, your ventilation, if you have a ventilation system, you could be somewhere in the region of 1 to 3 kilowatt hours would be usefully used every day. You work from home, you're probably talking about another 1 to 1.5 kilowatt hours a day that's in use that the sun could provide. If you have a lot of people in the house during the day, again, another 2 to 4 kilowatt hours. Baking, if you do a lot of baking, some people would do a lot of baking during the day. They use an oven would use around 2 kilowatts of a load. So you need to decide yourself if you're a heavy user. So we're a very heavy user and we use all of 4 kilowatts. Before we had kids, we were out during the day a lot, we wouldn't have used all of 1.5 kilowatt array. So this is just a curve of production from our system on the 14th of May, very sunny day. This is what happened. So it's just a sample of what happened during the day. So you see the shower coming on, you see the breakfast being had and toasters and kettles and so on, the dishwasher, the washing machine, lunch, second load in the washing machine because it was a sunny day. And then, we have a battery as well. The battery is fully charged up. And once it's fully charged, the electric vehicle absorbs all the power off the roof. And then you can see the evening usage in terms of ovens and so on. And you can see just the trace of the TV. You can see the fridge coming on the little spots and the freezer coming on for a longer bit. So you can see the base load is about 150 or 200 watts. So really you need to think about, are you a heavy user or a light user? And that's just the battery discharging where the sun wasn't producing enough and so on. So we still use, we fed in that day about a unit of power and we purchased about a unit of power. And that's really about the control system being able to react quickly to your home. So about, I think 97% of our energy was used from the roof. So in terms of some strategies to think about, and I've only got a slide or 2 left, buy for the future. So think about the next 10, 12, 15 years. It doesn't make sense to put in an array now and then come back and change it because it will add all the cost of scaffolding and everything else. So buy for the future. So be thinking about that. The marginal cost of additional panels is much less. So that means if you go for 2 or 2.5 kilowatts, the extra cost of the extra half kilowatt is not the same as quarter of the first. So definitely think about that. So the cost of sales or the scaffolding price and so on. I would think now is the right time to install at least a small battery. So 2.5 kilowatts or 2 kilowatts at a very minimum. With the expansion capability as they get cheaper, or if the feed-in tariff that we get next year is small, which we think it will be. And a small battery will allow things happen like your washing machine and tumble dryer, your washing machine and dishwasher will use the battery if the sun goes behind a cloud and things like that. So if you're 2 people and you're out all day, put a small system in with an immersion dump. If you have a large family, you work from home, it's on a farm or a business, you likely need a larger system. And if your EV is parked at home, definitely a large system and you'll use all that power. An east-west array is more expensive per unit of energy produced per kilowatt hour, but it's a more even production and you've less spills. So it starts earlier in the morning and it's later to the evening. So just my last slide, really, just to kind of think about what that will be. In 2021, June 21, we will be paid for production. So it certainly would to put in a larger battery, and therefore you won't be penalised as much for oversizing. It's unlikely that will incentivize people to build it to produce power to make money, but we never know. We have a change of government likely to happen. And really, if I think about what does it look like in terms of size, with the sort of characteristics of people, you know, certainly an electric vehicle would push up, particularly one that's located at, or there's a lot of working from home that we might be doing for the foreseeable future. That would encourage me to suggest a larger system would be sensible. So that's just a little table. I think I've kind of covered most of them, but it's worth just thinking about. You know, it's not very complicated, but just you need to understand how much energy you use. And a very easy way to do that is to read your meter at a particular time one day, and then read it at the same time next day or 3 or 4 days later and divide by the number of days. And that will tell you how much energy you use per day in the summer. And we're going to open up for questions, I think. Just the second poll there. On a scale of 1 to 5, do you think solar PV is difficult to purchase? Yeah, we have a lot of people saying yes. So it's noted as being not easy to purchase. So I hope today's webinar will help that. And we have a third poll there, which you might answer. And I'm just going to stop sharing my screen there. We have some Q&A, but I think we should be able to, Orla, you might tell me exactly how to do this, but are we going to look for people to raise hands? So we have Fintan McAvoy.
Finian, yeah. So if you want to go ahead, Finian.
We're trying to unmute you, Finian, but it doesn't seem to want to let us.
No, it doesn't.
You unmute yourself? Finian, I think you need to unmute yourself. The controls in the bottom left-hand side of the screen. I think Finian doesn't want to talk to us, really. Okay, I'll just maybe answer some of the questions that are here. We've answered some of them earlier by typing. In terms of how long does it take to get installed, a good crew will install 2 to 3 arrays in a day if they're close together and they're well organized in a long day. So I'd say about a half day is a typical installation time for, you know, something like a 2, 3, 4 kilowatt array. Question there from Patrick: does it make sense to tie solar PV with a hot water cylinder to act as a cheap battery to complement an oil boiler? It absolutely does. So I commented in the slide there about an immersion dump. So it's a small piece of equipment that just reads the amount of export and it stops it exporting and puts that power into your hot water cylinder. So I certainly would recommend that for every solar PV array, even if you have a battery. And you split the panels over 2 different roofs, e.g. main house and extension. So what I'd say in that case is, if they are not attached to each other, like for example, yeah, they're not, I suppose, wired together, you will need 2 different inverters, so they might be a little bit more expensive than one array. Second to that is if they're facing in different directions, you may need 2 different inverters, but it could be designed that it could work. And thirdly, if you are installing a battery, it will probably need to be connected to the larger array behind the inverter on the larger array. So you can, but you just need to think about it. Most good installers will be able to advise you and help you design that. Roof space is limited. Is it possible to extend over the side of the roof? No, and it wouldn't be recommended either from a wind load point of view. However, it is very possible to install on the ground. So some of our customers in super homes have basically put down weed block, gravel, and what you saw on the picture there from Tip County Council, they just mounted that on the ground, or you can install them on pillars and have them a little bit lifted up without even having to put down gravel. So you can do that, absolutely. Another question here, approximately what panels, with regards to panel size, approximately what size would be required? Oh yeah, sorry, there's a question earlier on about a camper van or a van of some kind. I did up a van once and sized some solar panels for the roof that I never purchased, but it's absolutely possible. So it's a very simple system. So it's a solar panel, a charge controller, and your battery. It might be a leisure battery or some form of 12-volt battery. And with regard to panel size, there are an array of small panel sizes specifically for camper vans. The standard cheapest panel is 1.6 to 1.7 meters long and 1 meter wide. And that would be what the very vast majority of solar panels produced in the world, i.e. the cheapest. So you might consider that as being a potential. Next question, doing a renovation at the moment. Is it cost prohibitive to install solar PV panels at the moment, but could afford it in a few years? Do I need to have my roof prepared now in order to be ready for panels in a few years? No, you don't. What I would say is when you have scaffolding up and you have an electrician on site, it makes a lot of sense to install solar panels. If you can't, what I would do is run a cable, an AC cable, the equivalent, it's not even a cooker cable, but a little bit smaller than a cooker cable that will take 4 kilowatts, and run that from your distribution board into a terminal about where your solar panels are going to be. Obviously have it disconnected at both ends, and therefore when you do go to put the solar installation in, the wiring of that main cable will be relatively easy. How much power does the 2020 house use, including heat? 13,500, sorry, it did disappear from the graph. So I would use about 13,500 and I would produce about 4,500 of that myself. So I purchase about 9,000 kilowatt hours of heat. But I don't purchase any diesel for my car and I don't purchase any heating oil for my house. So they're about 3.5 grand less of that energy use. How much thought do you need to give to positioning to allow for future power requirements? Is it easy to add more panels in the future? It is easy, but it's not sensible and it's not cheap. So what I would suggest you do if you're thinking about future power requirements is put them on now, or else wait a year or two and then put them on, at some point in the future. You will purchase, otherwise what will happen is you'll purchase an inverter that's too big and won't be as efficient, and you'll spend more on that inverter, and then you'll have to get a second set of scaffolding, a second electrician, and it will be relatively hard. All the certification requirements have to be redone. So I would suggest not doing that. It would be cheaper to borrow the additional money and pay the interest on the additional money for 3 or 4 years rather than do it that way. Can I use electricity gain from solar PV to heat my hot water? Yes. How does it work? I could get very technical here and I'll try not to bore everyone, but essentially what it does is it changes the voltage into your immersion. So if you have 300 watts extra of power that you're not using in your house, it will only run your immersion at 300 watts, and an immersion would usually run at 3,000 watts. And it's essentially a device, a solar iBoost or something similar. If you install the array on a garage rather than the house, could you install the associated plant for the system in the garage, and can this be used or can it be in the house? So The array to the inverter has to be a short distance. It's a DC, it's a 400-volt DC cable, and it's very dangerous. So the regulations encourage installers. It could potentially be done, but you wouldn't do it. It's more expensive, it's dangerous, and you try and keep that array or that wire as small as possible. But what you really want to do is take the direct current straight off the panels and into an inverter as quickly as possible. And there are additional regulated requirements if that route is long, and that adds cost to your system. So what I would say is do the AC conversion in the garage, connect it into your garage distribution board, and let it flow back into your house. It's very unlikely, unless you go for a very large array, that your garage wouldn't have a cable capable of taking the power into your distribution in the house. It's possible that you may have a 2.5 square out to your garage, which might be too small and might limit you to a 2 or 2.5 kilowatt array. But the electrician who comes to survey your distribution board will answer that question for you. Good question from Garode there. Roughly how much would it cost to audit, for an audit to design a PV system for your house? Is that more, or business, is that more advisable than to do it yourself? A good question. I would say that for a house, for a normal house, I would take the guidance that we've given. It's probably reasonably good. If you've got something a little bit more complicated than an audit, we typically aren't asked to do that for a house, so it probably would be around 300 or 400 euros. Is that more advisable than to do it for yourself? On a business scale, I would say yes. So what we do on a business scale, it costs a little bit more money, but we put a data logger in over a number of weeks, and then we analyze that data and size it accurately. So a lot of businesses would use us, and in particular Alan, to do that logging and sizing to get the right size system. John Smith asked, is there a rule of thumb for battery sizing? There are rules of thumbs for battery sizing. However, I would say that with the cost of batteries being still quite considerable, I would say that the laws of economics might overrule the rule of thumb for appropriate battery sizing. And also it does very much depend on what you use and when you use the power. So a 4 kilowatt array and a 10 kilowatt hour battery is a wonderful thing to have, but it isn't cheap, and it wouldn't necessarily be it wouldn't be our recommended thing just because of the cost. It would be fantastic to do, and from an environmental point of view, but that's the challenge. John also asked, do I need to survey my roof first to ensure it's okay for PV panels like weight or wind lift? Okay, so this is a good question. Your installer will have to design your system. So if you ring up an installer and ask them to come along, they will have to do that as part of their installation. So they will have to certify that the roof is okay for PV panels. Now, what I suppose it's important to say, a PV panel is about, I think it's a little bit less than 12 kilograms or something like that per square meter. So if you can consider you can stand on a roof, you might be 80 kilograms on a quarter of a square meter. So from a weight point of view, there's very few roofs that I would have any concern about. From a wind lift point of view, you may be concerned if you've got things like the standing seam, zinc roofs. Again, it can be done. It's just a question of making sure that they're installed properly to manufacturer specifications. And where we run into trouble on these is where those particular types of those metal skin roofs don't have an easy certified method of attaching. So the mounting systems are generally certified for particular roofs, and you know, if you contact the manufacturer of one of those roofs, they'll say, well, this is the mounting system you can use, and it's certified for it. But generally for a standard Irish 9x2 cross-batten slate or concrete panel roof, you shouldn't have any issue. But your installer's job is to make sure that that's done correctly. What kind of foundation requires to put panels in the garden? There's a couple of different methods. So there are systems that essentially use what's the equivalent of a concrete railway sleeper, which is you don't need to put anything in the ground, so you don't need a foundation. You can mount them in concrete, or you can pile them directly into the ground, or you can just put a gravel bed and a very simple mounting system. So there's a number of different methods of doing it depending on ground condition and desire of the client. But you know, some people do a reinforced foundation for ground mounted panels. I would suggest if you do a quick Google on some of the ground mounting systems, you'll see a vast array very quickly. Would PV integrate well with the heat pump for, say, a dairy farm? Are there case studies available for this in Ireland? I might let Alan answer that question, who has just been looking at some dairy farms.
Yeah, I suppose for a dairy farm, what we found in a number of dairy farms is that a lot of the power is used in the start of the day and at the end of the day, obviously when you're milking. So a lot of the time the PV, you'd need a battery for the PV, and in some circumstances, depending on the dairy farm and the size of the dairy farm, if it's a quite big dairy farm and they're using power during the day, yes, it may. Now, in terms of a heat pump, I suppose, you know, obviously if you're running your heat pump to heat your hot water, if you do it at nighttime, you're using a 6 cent instead of during the day. So instead of offsetting your cost of electricity, as I was saying, at 20 or 23 cent during the day, you're really offsetting the cost of the array at 6 cent if you're using the heat pump, or because the heat. So it'll have to be looked at a case by case basis. And again, what we do there as well, and we're doing one at the minute, is we're actually logging. As Paul said, we have an energy logger on the farm. It's going to be there for a few weeks. We'll take it off, and then once we have an idea of what power they're actually using during the day, we can then make an informed decision then on whether PV will be practical or not.
Very good, thank you, Alan. What is the typical price of a battery? I might ask you to answer that one, Alan, as well.
I don't know. I don't know.
They typically vary from about €2,000. I could be wrong at the bottom end for a DC, just straight into the inverter, 2 kilowatt, up to you know, maybe 7,000 or 8,000 for a very large battery, like a 10 or 15 kilowatt hour battery. And ideally, you know, when we talk about batteries, if you're putting in a battery, you want the battery to be coupled directly to the solar panels at a DC level, because otherwise, you see, every time you go from DC to AC or back, you lose about 10 or 15%. So if the solar panels charge the battery directly before they're supplied into the house, you remove a lot of losses. So when you're installing a battery, the cost can be, I'd say, more affordable when you consider the grants available if you put a small battery in at the time of the solar installation. There's a few more questions. I'll keep answering them. Feel free to leave if you wish. Can you design the system? Anne has asked, can you design the system to generate power when the grid is off in your area? So yes, you can. You can design a switchover system or a backup power system. It costs extra. It's relatively limited in what it can do, and it is typically not done very often. We have one of the highest percentage uptimes for grids in Ireland. However, if you live in a remote area and you're subjected to frequent power cuts, you could install this system. It's very rare that I've heard it done, but you can get backup systems. However, they will be limited in terms of what they can run. So a typical inverter might produce 3 kilowatts of power at peak, and they will limit you to, so you wouldn't be able to run things like ovens, electric cookers, kettles, toasters, hair dryers, things like that that use a lot of energy. But you would be able to run things like a fridge, a well pump, or the things that allow you kind of keep going during a power cut. Was looking at a portable battery for an electric lawnmower. Is it feasible to get one that either plugs straight into the inverter or plug into the wall and hope it's powered by the PV during the day? Yeah, you typically can't, John Smith has asked this question, really, you typically can't plug directly into the DC side of a PV array, so you go up to AC and back down. That will change in time. There's a lot of people talking about potential for DC wiring in homes, but right now that would not be something I would recommend, and you'd want to be very, very careful about that. Garode has asked again, what about a community looking to do a PV project? Is there an optimum profile of on-site energy use that would make it worthwhile for a community centre to put up PV on its roof? I think we're focusing really today on domestic power as much as possible. But really, if you think about what we've discussed in terms of a house, a community centre isn't going to be very different, or any business isn't going to be different. What you really want to see is power consumed between, you know, kind of 9, 10 in the morning and 5, 6 in the afternoon in the summer. And if you've got energy use in that time, it would be quite cost effective to put up a PV array. And the best way to think about that is there a lot of activity, and what type of activity is that? In the case of a fire, is there a shut-off switch? So Sean, you've asked a question which is kind of a little bit outside of my direct understanding. So there is a regulation related to the length of the DC cable between panels and the inverter. I think it's a meter, but I'm not sure, which is why most installers try and install the inverter as close to the system as possible, so the DC shut-off switch isn't there. There is guidance available. I haven't read it in about 5 years, and I'm not going to try and repeat it, but there is guidance for fire officers on solar panels. We installed some solar panels in 2014 on the side of a fire station, and it was one of the first questions that came up. But there is quite a lot of detail and guidance. There is a shut-off switch on the inverter is AC coupled, so it's the same as any circuit in a house. However, the DC, you do not put choppers through a DC cable, so it's quite dangerous, hence the need for 1 meter minimum. Would lead-acid batteries be usable for storage for a PV array, the type they use at UPS? So someone asked that question whose name is you. So yes, lead-acid batteries could work. However, lead-acid batteries, the standard type of lead-acid batteries, we say deep cycle batteries, the kind they use at UPS, have about 1,000 cycles life. A gel lead acid battery would be a little bit higher at about 2,000 cycles, and a typical car would have an 80% life at 3,000 or 4,000 cycles. But the domestic lithium iron or lithium iron polymer batteries that you buy typically have an 80% life at 10,000 cycles. So while the answer is yes, they could be used, you wouldn't want to buy them for it. If you got yourself a handful of lead acid batteries and you wanted to reuse them, you could, but I wouldn't suggest it's a good idea. All right, is there any grants for farm buildings? Yes, TAMS is available for farms, and I'll get Alan to answer what's the size and scale of TAMS.
Yeah, I'm not actually sure. I think it's maybe around 12 kilowatts. But yeah, there are sort of 40% grant or 60% grant if you're a young farmer. So yeah, those grants are available.
Okay. John Burgess has asked, when considering PV and EV battery charging, will one need a smart charging meter that can use PV instead of grid electricity? Do you have schematics for these arrangements? Will car charger arrangements? I'll answer the questions one by one. I think I know John. Hi, John. So yes, there are a lot of the car chargers available can use your export. So it reads your incomer, and if you set it to a particular mode, it will set your incomer to 0 and charge your car. The one that I have is called Zappy. It would have been the market leader kind of a year and a half ago in this regard, but I'm sure others do the same. And it's relatively cost effective. There's not much of a difference in price. It's very simple. So I have 3 modes. I've normal, doesn't look at the PV, and then I've got 2 modes of eco. One will only use the power off the roof, and one will use a minimum of 1.5 kilowatts and will rise up if there's additional power available from the PV in particular. In terms of schematics, it's very, very simple. You plug you get your distribution board, you put a standard breaker for your PV, you put your standard breaker for your EV charger connected to that, and you put a CT on the main incomer. And I think that also has a CT on the PV, but I'm not entirely sure if it needs it. So I'm not sure if that's the case. Will car charging arrangement in the vehicle itself impact on the PV installation? So the answer to that question is yes. If you have the car set to work on night rate only, it won't allow the PV to use. So for what we do in the winter, we leave it on night rate, and if we feel it's going to be a sunny day, you can just override that with a button. We just have a standard Leaf, a 2016 Nissan Leaf, and Alan's kid to say hello, which means you're going to have to sign a consent form for the thanks, Alan. And the last question, the working from home, it's not a question, it's a statement. The working from home situation is a real game changer. It absolutely is, particularly when you include electric cars. I know from our point of view, we could probably use 5 kilowatts of installed capacity and use it all. And so that is the last question that we have. So we're about 10 minutes over, but I think we got through all the questions, and there's been quite a few. So we've 32 questions answered. Thanks very much for attending. It's great to see such a large turnout. I hope it's all very useful, and I hope you've all got a lot out of it. I just see one comment there: inverter will shut down if the grid is not there. That's absolutely the case unless you have an automatic switch to switch. If the grid goes down, it'll switch the inverter to run off grid. So I think I have most of the other questions answered, but thank you very much everyone for attending. If anyone wants to find out about heat pumps and their use in flexibility grids and how to optimize them and so on, we're hosting a webinar on heat pumps really aimed at installers on the 24th of June, if I'm not mistaken, Orla?
Yep, 24th of June. Yeah, at the earlier time of 5 o'clock.
Earlier time of 5 o'clock. So thank you all very much.